Let Elizabeth Jane Fauffray be not told of my death or made to grieve on account of me, and that I be not buried in consecrated ground, and that no sexton be asked to toll the bell, and that nobody is wished to see my dead body, and that no mourners walk behind me at my funeral, and that no flowers be planted on my grave, and that no man remember me. To this I put my name, Michael Hinchard. Hello there, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the Mayor of Casterbridge, and Mayor of Casterbridge was written by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was born in 1840 in Stinsford, England, and lots of his novels, including The Mayor of Casterbridge, take place in a fictional place with like the south and southwest of England called Wessex, that he calls Wessex, and Casterbridge is one of those cities. Casterbridge is essentially Dorchester, which is where Hardy lived most of his life, but yeah, he just calls it Casterbridge in his novels. I just want to hop right in. The novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, this was my first novel that I read by Thomas Hardy, and it was actually pretty good, but it's more modern, I guess 19th century stuff, you know, is kind of depresso. Well, at least it seems that way. It pretty much starts with the man whose will I just read, Michael Hinchard. He was walking to pretty much a fairground with his wife Susan and their little daughter Elizabeth Jane, and once they get there, they start to eat, and there's a bootlegger, and she pretty much will spike the food for you. And so he gets completely wasted, gets completely drunk, and when he's drunk, he actually sells his wife and daughter to a sailor named Newsom. It's quite shocking at first, and then he passes out. He sells them for 5 shillings, and then when he wakes up, he finds the wedding ring on the floor because she had thrown it at him. And he's like, oh, well, it wasn't just a nightmare. And so he goes and looks around for them. He walks miles and miles to try to find them. And he can't find them, can't find any trace of them really, except for maybe the fact that they've gone on some boat and left, which is true. They actually did go to Canada for some time. But he goes to a church and makes a promise to God that he would never drink for as many years as he had been alive at that time. And at that time he was 21, so he promises that he won't drink for the next 21 years. And that's pretty much where we find him next. The story fast forwards about 19 years, and Susan and Elizabeth Jane have made their way to Casterbridge to find Hinchard. And Susan hasn't told Elizabeth Jane that Hinchard is her father, just said that he's some distant relative and such, and since their husband, Newsom, had died on the sea, she came and was looking for Hinchard because it's their only known relative. They end up finding out that he is the mayor of Casterbridge. At this point, he's made a name for himself pretty much, and he was a hay trusser, so he has like a big business doing that, and he's made a lot of money, but he also became very influential, and he doesn't drink, so he doesn't do stupid decisions as he used to do when he was drunk. And so he's quite prominent. He's like lives in the biggest house in town, and he's very rich, doing very well for himself. But when they find him, he just hires Donald Fauffray, who's a Scotsman, and he was planning to go to the United States to do his farming such. Hinchard was able to convince him to stay on as like his right-hand man. And so Fauffray stays in town, and then Susan meets secretly with Hinchard, and Hinchard and her decide that we're gonna act like we're just distant relatives, and then we'll get married, and Elizabeth Jane can be my stepdaughter, even though she's my actual daughter, but we don't want some sort of scandal for her, and Elizabeth Jane doesn't know, we don't want her to know, and so they get married. And then at that point, Elizabeth Jane and Donald Fauffray are kind of courting each other. Donald's been kind of courting her, and she really likes him. And Susan actually dies. Susan gets sick and dies. Hinchard reads a letter that he was not supposed to read. It said not that he wasn't to read it until the day that Elizabeth Jane got married, and he read it and found out that Elizabeth Jane actually wasn't his daughter. Their Elizabeth Jane had died shortly after he sold them, and she had another daughter with Newsom. She named her Elizabeth Jane, just like her and Hinchard's daughter. And so because of this, he starts to really resent Elizabeth, and he's already at this point starting to resent Donald, because Donald is very successful and doing very well for himself. He's very likable, so lots of people are starting to like him a lot more than Hinchard himself. One of the criticisms of this book is he actually released it like on a weekly basis for some paper, and so there's a little bit too many events. Is like that's what the main criticism is, that there's too much stuff that happens in the book. But at the same time, there's a woman named Lucetta who he had relations with her when he was in Jersey, because she's from Jersey, and he was there on business, and he got sick and she took care of him, and I guess they made love. I don't know. He said that he would marry her pretty much, but Susan came back into his life, and so he couldn't do that anymore. And now that Susan was gone, he said he could pretty much marry her. And she used to be poor and stuff, but she came into an inheritance. One of her aunts died, and so now she's quite wealthy, and she moved into Casterbridge pretty much for Michael to meet with him, Michael Hinchard. And at this point, Donald's been fired by Hinchard, and Donald's starting his own business on the opposite side of town. And Elizabeth is really mistreated by her father. He pretty much just ignores her and does not talk to her, and he's not kind to her. And so he meets Lucetta, not knowing who she is, visiting her mother's grave, and actually they kind of hit it off in a way, and Lucetta actually offers to have her stay with her. And so Elizabeth moves in with Lucetta, and as Donald was passing by to visit Elizabeth Jane at Lucetta's place, Donald and Lucetta start flirting, and they pretty much hit it off, which I was really disappointed in Donald at that point. He seemed like a pretty stand-up guy, and then he did that to Elizabeth. And then same with Lucetta, like she totally ignores Michael. She doesn't really like him. She likes Donald a lot more than Michael, just like everybody else, but she totally, like, I feel like mistreats Elizabeth in that regard. I feel like Elizabeth is rather mistreated throughout this. Because Donald and Lucetta are getting together, Michael Hinchard hires back his old guy that he was supposed to hire in place of Donald, but Donald showed up and he was great and whatever. So he hires Jop. Jop kind of runs the business into the ground with Michael. So Michael is actually, like, destitute at this point. He's no longer the mayor. Donald actually gets made the mayor. So he's pretty much the old Michael Hinchard. It's just poor and impoverished. And Donald and Lucetta get married, and because of that, Elizabeth goes back to live with Michael, and he becomes a lot nicer at that point. He doesn't really like Donald still, but he is much more endearing to Elizabeth, even though it's not his actual flesh and blood. He is like, well, this is all I have left, and so he is nice to her. And he's actually been living with Jop and stuff, and so him and Elizabeth get a room with Jop. At this point, Newsom actually comes back, finds Hinchard, and he explains to him that he had heard Susan has died, but he wants to see Elizabeth Jane. He knew that Susan was a very simple person, and he knew that Susan felt obligated to go see Hinchard, her actual lawful husband, but she also felt inclined to stay with Newsom because he technically paid for her, and she felt like she couldn't just leave, especially after he had been so good to them. And so he faked his death, really. He sailed back across to Canada, and he just had a letter sent saying that his ship had sunk and he drowned at sea. And he heard Susan had died, but he came back to see Elizabeth Jane, and Hinchard actually lies and says, oh, she's dead too, and sends him away. And Newsom just leaves. I guess he believes it, and he's away for several months. And Hinchard actually tries to follow him before he gets on the wagon out of town to, like, be like, oh, I'm sorry, I lied. It's just like, it was his gut instinct to say, like, this is all I have left, you can't have her, pretty much. But he doesn't catch up with them, and then eventually Donald and Lucetta are going strong pretty much. So there were some letters that Michael Hinchard and Lucetta had written to each other while they were still in love with each other, and he is going to return them to Lucetta so she can burn them and destroy them, and he doesn't want to be seen at her place, so he gives them to Jop. And Jop, instead of going straight there, because she was kind of nasty to him, Lucetta was kind of nasty to him, she goes to, like, the crappy part of town and goes drinking, and pretty much spills the beans that Lucetta and Hinchard had an affair at some point. The rowdy bunch of the town decides that they're gonna do a skimmity ride or a skimmington ride, and that's pretty much where they make, like, little effigies of the unfaithful parties, and they parade them around town pretty much to make fun of adultery and to shame the people. And so they do this. I don't understand it exactly. I thought it was, like, really biased towards Lucetta, because they make one for Hinchard and they make one for Lucetta, but they completely ignore Hinchard. Like, they don't really focus on him at all. They go straight to Lucetta's house and do it, and she recognizes it, and she faints, gets really sick, and she actually ends up dying herself. After that, things kind of just continue. Donald eventually starts to court Elizabeth Jane again, and then Hinchard is kind of melancholy. He actually goes to kill himself once by jumping off a bridge, but he sees the effigy of him swirling around in the water, and so he thinks it's like a sign from God that he shouldn't do that. It kind of terrifies him. He doesn't do it. But all he has is Elizabeth Jane. But then eventually Newsom comes back, and he knows Newsom comes back, and he knows that Elizabeth is going to meet him at Donald's house. And so instead of facing his guilt, he kind of runs away, and he leaves town because he's afraid that Elizabeth won't love him anymore when she finds out that he's lied to her about her actually being his daughter and such. And so Elizabeth and Newsom are reunited, and then Donald and Elizabeth Jane are engaged to be married. And so this happens for a couple months that Michael is just away, but then it's on the day of the wedding, he's like, well, I really want to see Elizabeth, and I really want to say I'm sorry, and he really wants to like congratulate her on the marriage. And so he buys a finch, buys some nice clothes, and he goes back to Casterbridge, and he leaves the finch outside, and later it dies from neglect because nobody knows it's there, and goes inside and requests a maid to go get Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is upset with him, obviously, because he had lied to her, and he said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come out, you'll never see me again, pretty much. And so he leaves. And then it's only a couple weeks later, I'm pretty sure, that they find a dead finch that he had gotten for her, and when they connect that he had gotten it for her for their wedding, she feels kind of guilty and she wants to go find him. They go a couple towns over, and they find Abel Whittle, who used to be he's a laborer for Donald, he used to labor for Hinchard, and they find him walking along the road, and they're like, hey, what are you doing here, pretty much? They're like, oh, well, on the night of your wedding, I saw Michael Hinchard, like, leaving, and he seemed really down, and I was following him, just like, hey, like, what's wrong? I can help you. You've been good to me in the past. I'll try to be good to you now. And essentially, they just missed Michael dying. He died like half hour before they got there, and Abel was just getting back from burying him. They read his will, and that's pretty much the end of the story. Michael Hinchard was kind of a bad dude. Like, he did a lot of awful things during the course of the story, and it seems more melancholy throughout the story. There's a couple quotes from Michael, and I want to get you guys' opinion on it, but they're throughout the story. And he said, it's not by what is in this life, but by what appears that you are judged. And he said that also, 'tis not our greatest doings that the world gets wind of. With those quotes in mind, I almost feel bad for him. I feel kind of guilty for condemning him. He meant well. I don't think most people mean to do things that they know are awful. Obviously, it happens at points, but I think that overall, most people aren't evil. And I think Hinchard is one of those people. I think that he just had an ill lot, really. I want to know what you guys think. I know that it's rather depressing. In a way, he kind of deserved it because of how awful he was, especially to Elizabeth Jane and to Susan and Lucetta and to Donald. But at the same time, I kind of can't help but feeling bad for him. I don't know if that's what Hardy was going for. I just want to know what you guys think. And sorry for spoilers if you're planning on reading it. To be honest, I had never heard of this book until a couple months ago, and I decided to read it. So if any of you guys are interested, I usually go for Barnes & Noble Classics edition. That's what I went for. But I just want to, know what you guys think, and I appreciate you guys watching. And next week, we'll be going over our first sculpture. We're going to look into the works of the Harlem Renaissance sculptor, Augustus Abbott. And so I hope you guys are excited for that. And I'll see you guys next week, and thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like and subscribe.